The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseWare continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseWare at ocw.mit.edu.
Okay, so this is Adam Smith, 1776, and the concept of an economy. And, you know, the word economy gets spelled with an O in it, but it means the same thing. And it is a word that we see appearing in various places. Sort of, what does economy suggest, just kind of from a general sense? Without any specialized knowledge, what would you associate with the word economy?
Kind of like an organization of labor or skill.
Okay, organization, we get some sense of order and some sense of organized behavior, if you will. Because when you say organization, you're suggesting, you know, people collectively doing something. And this is a observation that really is prevalent in this work, that people work together in amazing ways to produce all kinds of things. And Smith gives the name economy. Now, Smith didn't invent this whole set of discussions. There were a lot of other people in his time discussing concepts of how, you know, how products were produced, profits, things of this sort, struggling to understand the way things worked. But Smith, in his Wealth of Nations, really brought together a body of work that had been developing through the 18th century. And so he's associated with the whole concept of economics and the notion of how to study the production of wealth. So this is a key work. Many people consider it. It's a little like the origins. You know, many people consider Wealth of Nations one of the great books, if not the greatest book of the 18th century, simply because it put into play a whole set of complicated arrangements, but simplified them in many ways by observing some of the patterns of behavior. And pattern recognition is a big, you know, Smith sees patterns. And you can debate, as you'll find. Our reading for next week is Malthus, for Wednesday is Malthus. And Malthus had some objections to Smith, but, you know, both of these, both Smith and Malthus approached their subject matter in a similar way. So part of the background to Smith is the rise of manufacture, the fact that people were beginning to think about organized ways to produce goods for profit. And Diderot's encyclopedia, which we actually had an exhibit on last year. I think it's been taken down now, but this encyclopedia was a great encyclopedia of arts and trades and crafts. Really captured a lot of the kinds of workshops that had been developing through the 18th century into organized spaces for labor, bringing labor out of the localized sort of cottage industry into the more organized shop floor, or the shop where, you know, people were beginning to, you know, identify a project, making pins, or making screws, or making nails, or making some fundamental kind of implement that was used widely in society. The idea began to emerge of, you know, not just having a group of people distributed around the country make it and then go and collect them, but to centralize that labor, bring it together into a room and begin to work with it. And this is, and so a lot of these ideas were captured in Diderot's encyclopedia, and you see an example of a shop floor here. They're actually making screw threads. And, you know, they bring in machines, different people are working at different benches, and you see how what's happening, what's taking place here. A kind of specialization and diversification. Very powerful set of ideas that began to take hold and gave rise to, of course, the big revolutions in industry, in industrial production. So this sort of development of a whole series of interactions and markets and specialized production and so forth began to be seen as some kind of a organism, if you will, or organic, or a system, a complex system we would call it today. They didn't have that term then. And so, you know, it really was a tremendous innovation because it created great wealth, new wealth. Wealth on the part of people who were entrepreneurs, not just, you know, wealth because, you know, you were the feudal lord or you were somebody higher, very high in the inherited aristocracy, but wealth through production of goods that in turn generated income and funds and for more production. So this was a big deal and a major part of the background to Smith and his Wealth of Nations. And of course the title of the book, Wealth of Nations, the notion that whole nations are involved. This is something of national scale, something of vast scale, huge, much bigger than any sort of single local setting. It's sort of a network of things. Okay, so I sent you this just because I wanted to capture this. I sent this in your slides so that you could get the key. You know, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he goes through the whole process of producing pins. And as he says, you know, a single person doing all these different steps to make pins would be lucky to, you know, make a few in a day. Whereas if you get a group of people to specialize in the various steps of pin making and identify, rationalize those steps, decide what has to be done for each, you can vastly increase the production. So as he mentions, 10 people can make, he says, those 10 persons in the bold there, those 10 persons therefore could make among them upwards of 48,000 pins in a day. Each person therefore making a tenth part of 48,000 pins might be considered as making 4,800 pins in a day. But if they had all wrought separately and independently and without any of them having been educated to this particular business, they certainly could not each of them have made 20. So this magnification of labor is very impressive. And you know, people, I mean, this isn't like this is an old way of thinking. We don't do this anymore. I mean, we still think about labor in these terms. We still think about how to, you know, divide steps of production of everything from food to implements. We are still in this business of trying to rationalize labor and understand how to make it more and more effective and more productive. Productivity is a big deal. I mean, the economists today still study it. So this is an idea that emerged in the Wealth of Nations, and as we don't want to make Smith into the inventor of all these ideas. He was a collector of ideas, a person who synthesized a lot of work of many, many people thinking, but he put it all together in a book.
One of the things that happens with this too is that when you divide up labor and you're able to increase manufacture, the manufacturer kind of bootstraps itself, because for every nail you make, you can build a better house, which you can, have better construction practices. Like, for example, I heard this story that who made the first lathe because you need the proper grinders and rotors and all that. So what they did is they made it by hand, and they made the worst lathe they could, and they used that lathe to make all the new parts for the next lathe, and they kept bootstrapping that until they have the extremely fine-tuned high-performance lathes that we have today. And the same goes for nails and houses and buildings and whatever.
You're absolutely right. It's back to this workshop floor. You know, when you have a bunch of people sitting, labor together, you know, they not only get better at what they're doing, but they talk to each other, and they interact, and they come up with new ways of doing stuff. And if they're all kind of in it for some kind of self-gain, you know, that's an ideal setting for innovation. Getting people together, getting them thinking about it, getting them focused on the tasks, and talking about how do you do it better. So, why does specialization work? In Smith's view, it can be traced to three different factors. One is, of course, increased dexterity. What does he mean by that? Increased dexterity.
You just get better at what you're doing. If you do the same thing 100 times, you're going to be better at it.
Yeah. He says those little boys, he used another example of those little boys making nails. And he says, you know, these kids could, you know, together, if they worked, they could make a couple of thousand of them a piece. And, you know, they're really, really good at what they do. They do one thing. What's the problem with that? You get pretty tedious, right? Just doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. You know, and the early factory system was pretty brutal. I mean, Smith paints a very robust picture of it, and rightly so. I mean, he's sort of looking at it from the large scale. He's taking the kind of Cleanthes look, you know, look at this great labor thing. But when you get down to the details, you know, some of these early labor organizations were pretty brutal, and child labor and all these things. So, you know, there's a big social cost here that, you know, we have to keep aware of. But yes, increased dexterity. The more you do something, the better and better you get at it, the more of a master you become at it. And, you know, this holds for practically every kind of human endeavor we can think of, even in the arts. Not just even in the arts, you know, to become a great cellist, it takes a lot of time, many, many thousands of hours. And to become a great laboratory researcher, you know, in the state of the art, it's going to be the same thing. Whatever the human endeavor is, it's going to take a tremendous amount of input on the part of the individual. But that input has a impact in increasing the capacity in the performance. So yeah, increased dexterity. Time savings. Traces the second factor, the time savings. How does time savings, what's he talking about here? Charles?
So like if you didn't divide your labor and one person had to do several steps or all of the steps, and after doing the first step he had to go figure out the second step, or like go work on the second step, and so like until the last step. And so like the example he provides is of more or less a farmer. Like it's by necessity that he has to do all the steps of harvesting and planting, but that's only possible because it's seasonal and he's not doing all of those at once, right? And so if you specialize, you can save time, transportation, or just figuring things out, and also you would have less dexterity if you did more things.
Yeah, it's basically the old problem of shifting tasks. I mean, not too many people shift seamlessly from one task to another. There's always a cost as you reset and refocus. And if you're continually doing that, there's a lot of time absorbed just in the transition periods. And finally, the third he mentions is innovation. What does he mean by innovation? I guess we sort of mentioned it.
Yeah, kind of like what you said earlier. Just if you're doing the same task over and over, you're always going to be looking like, hey, how can I make this better? So like the example with the guy with the kid with the fire engine.
Yeah.
He wants to go play with his friend, so he figures, hey, I can just tie a string and it'll do my job.
Yeah. This is that's a cute example. It's said to be apocryphal by some people, but the point is, people make innovation. They do all kinds of things. I mean, you must have all worked in places where, you were doing something at one time and you suddenly thought, gee, if I do this, it's going to be that much easier. I mean, you're always trying to save your labor. Labor's hard. So if you can figure out some way to cut a corner, you do it. So, yeah, he's got a very charming example here. Whoever has been much accustomed to visit such manufacturers must frequently have been shown very pretty machines, which were the inventions of such workmen in order to facilitate and quicken their own particular part of the work. So that goes back to that lathe shop that I showed you from Diderot. Lots and lots of machines were being invented to, increase labor. Looms and things of that sort were being, more and more developed that could be driven by water power and then steam power and so forth. These sort of automatic mechanisms that could actually carry out all these tasks. So, and as you were saying, the crude lathe at first starts and it's clunky and so forth, and then somebody else comes and over a series of innovations, the machines themselves begin to improve. There's an incredible amount of improvement through the development and innovation of mechanical devices, both for magnifying labor, for extending it, for appropriating and dispatching it. So yeah, so he says. In the first fire engines, a boy was constantly employed to open and shut alternately the communication between the boiler and the cylinder according to the piston, as the piston either ascended or descended. One of those boys who loved to play with his companions observed that by tying a string from the handle of the valve which opened this communication to another part of the machine, the valve would open and shut without his assistance and leave him at liberty to divert himself with his playfellows. One of the greatest improvements that has been made upon this machine since it was first invented was in this manner the discovery of a boy who wanted to save his own labor. And it sort of throws me back to thinking, Hume and the great shipbuilder and those massive, beautiful ships that they built to, ply the seas and trade, those schooners and so forth. Well, they did many, many things, including many terrible things. But the workmanship of these vast, complicated ships was incredible, but it was probably wasn't probably the product of some grand designer who said, "Oh, I shall build this great ship." A lot of just people, everyday people who were skilled and very good at what they did and added something to the whole. This whole complex organism of a ship emerged. So. Again, there's a new understanding of labor, the possibilities of labor as being more than just kind of iterative, the same old thing over and over. Labor is something that works in interesting channels and collects and produces things. And, the product, sometimes we think too much of the great genius doing the, labor, the genius, the collective genius of many, many people working on an art or on a type of production is very, very powerful, very amazing. I always, of course, I'm in biology. Does specialization work in biology? This is just a cute little evolutionary question here. Do organisms certain types of biology talks about dogs working together. I think dogs probably, we know from our contemporary studies of animal behavior that many animals actually do work collectively to produce things. Do they work progressively to produce better and better things? That's another question. But they do collectively form groups and various types of families. And, you know, if you see one of those, I don't know, those films on wild dogs in Africa chasing down their prey, and you watch the complex kinds of behavior that are taking place there, you realize that organisms can do some pretty amazing things collectively too. Or if you look at beehives and things of that sort. So we do have a lot of good examples of collective animal behavior, but it's probably all driven not by rational process, but more by instinct. So my question was, in other sense, does specialization work in biology?
Well, so if you look at smaller biology, like cell, in terms of cells of any organism, cells are obviously specialized. For the first moments of any cell's life as a stem cell, they were basically indistinguishable, and then they go out just like people do, and they do their one thing really well, and that's why we can function. If our cells tried to do everything, then we wouldn't look the way we do now. We wouldn't have skin cells. Like everything would just look this. We'd be like a blob, more or less.
Okay.
So I think it works.
All right. That's so at the cellular level, you know, nothing can be more impressive than the kind of cellular specialization that you find in an organism, especially a complex organism. Yeah, Dan.
Animals and creatures by nature tend to be as well adapted to their environment as they possibly can be, and I guess that's what I consider a form of specialization. Is that, you know, rather than having, for example, like look at us, we're not particularly suited to any one thing, but we're dexterous enough to be able to do stuff. But you look at, for example, certain kinds of fish that live deep in the ocean. You can see that they are absolutely fine-tuned. They only live there. They only do certain things, and so I think in that sense, specialization absolutely occurs.
Everywhere.
Yeah,
it really is impressive. There are insects that are developed that have physical apparatus that will only interact with another kind of prey, and if that prey is gone, they just can't. They are so specialized that their entire bodies. So. Yeah, there's a concept of specialization in biological diversification. You know, you look at a biological tree. I mean, what is it about if it's not about specialization? The whole concept of developing. So, you know, it's an interesting. Not that Smith was thinking about biology or Darwin was necessarily thinking about Smith. However, this notion of specialization in large, complex systems is a penetrating and interesting notion. And to come back to Smith, and keep in mind that Darwin does, again, I don't want to make too much of this, but Darwin does use the word of economy quite a bit in the origin. The animal economy. He thinks of it as an economy. So what's interesting about these large, complex, quote, economies is that they are the products of what? Who made them? How do they come into existence? What is their method of origin? How do they emerge? Let's see. Who else can say something here? Elijah.
I guess it's just sort of the natural system. The system sort of naturally tends to form an economy.
Okay.
You know, as specialization occurs, they get more and more efficient. So.
Okay. What drives this? You know, what motivation, human motivation, drives this specialization?
Is this in the evolutionary?
Well, I'm thinking now of Smith. Well, you could say everything is in some sense.
I guess it'd be financial gain, which sort of drives it.
Okay, in the economy, the financial, or at least finance being a metaphor for the ability
to sustain yourself. Yeah. So everybody is involved in some way or another, because Well, he says his famous invisible hand argument. Every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue of the society as great as he can. He generally, indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain, and he is thus, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. These are non-intended systems.
I personally found the idea of the invisible hand very interesting. Just the thought that having a self-preserving mentality would in itself be good for society. And then you think about how, when people go too far with that, like you have businesses who their first and foremost goal is to make a profit and it can be at the expense of others.
Yeah.
And at some point it can hurt the economy.
Yeah.
So I think in that sense there is a counter argument to the invisible hand.
Yeah, those people.
Those people with all those derivatives and so forth, they sort of, their self-interest drove. So, I mean, some people say, well, greed is good and so on, and I can assure you that's not what Smith had in mind with self-interest. But you could push his argument and say, well, if everybody, as he says here, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. So these people involved in this economy aren't trying to help other people. They're trying to help themselves. But in Smith's view, that's great. When everybody tries to help himself or herself, they drive the economy and produce new levels of wealth. And everybody gets to share at some level in that wealth. So self-interest is good. We sometimes call it, quote, enlightened self-interest as opposed to dark self-interest, or I don't know what the word is. But let me just finish. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. He's not a big believer in, giving handouts. Okay, so this is all done, and I emphasize no part of his intention. Non-intended complex systems. Nobody made the economy. It happened just through human desire to exchange and survive. And so this is a sort of a natural product of humans interacting with each other. So, I won't go into this, but this whole notion of self-interest as a motivating force of human behavior. So, people want to gain goods. They want to go to the shopping malls. They want to, whatever is available. They want to go shopping. People get upset with the notion that we're a nation of shoppers, but I think people have always been nations of shoppers in some sense. They're always out to find, to get the food that they need to live and to improve their surroundings, at least at some level, and so and clothe themselves, feed and clothe themselves. So, yeah, it gets out of hand sometimes, and luxury comes in, but Smith even has a place for luxury here. Okay. So in almost every other race of animals, each individual, when it has grown up to maturity, is entirely independent, and in its natural state has occasion for the assistance of no other living creature. But man has almost constant occasion for the help of his brethren, and it is in vain for him to expect it from their benevolence only. He will be more likely to prevail if he can interest their self-love in his favor. Okay, so this is a kind of a naturalized motivation. It's not to. So he's he's finding motivation in natural behavior, and that's motivation for social good, in natural human behavior as compared to what? It's not through religious desire to be a good person in Smith's system. This sort of is an important point, is that the behavior of humans is you see this as cynical.
Yeah.
Okay. In what sense?
It was like everyone's greedy, and therefore mankind move towards the better.
Okay.
All right. It certainly, you can certainly take that. You can see that in it. Anybody else think Smith is cynical, or is it just a word that doesn't apply to him, or is he beyond that, or beneath that, or what?
I think it's realistic. I think everyone is. I mean, ultimately, when the day ends, out for themselves. They want to. Everyone's pretty selfish.
Okay.
So I think it's
selfish.
Yeah. It's a realistic view.
Okay. Any other comments on this great new economic? Any other thoughts? Well, Jennifer, what do you think? Is he cynical?
I feel like if you were cynical, though, you might see like problems that, like, if people got too greedy. He kind of like has faith that their greed has limits, and that everything will just work itself out. But he doesn't really consider people who go to extremes, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, he does mention people who get great wealth, and what do they do with their wealth?
They're like share like
they spend it on stuff.
And somebody has to make the stuff. So in Smith's kind of, as you said, I think the phrase you use, it will sort itself out. I think is very much, Smith is very much that, of that mentality. Things sort themselves out. And without these drives in the economy, you wouldn't have the growth in wealth. So yeah, there's an element of cynicism in it, but there's also a concept here, the production of wealth, that the collective whole shares at some level. And yeah, some people get a lot more than other people, but then they spend it in dumb ways, or they go buy baubles, or they do whatever they do with it, and it ultimately gets back into the economy. Whether that's, I mean, somebody might say that's too idealized. It's really Panglossian. Smith is a kind of a Panglossian thinker, because he thinks that, all is for the best. I mean, this is a system in which all is for the best, isn't it? Sort of.
But it's kind of the opposite of Pangloss. Like, it's like the same but different in like how Pangloss says, like, every person's individual's misfortune is for the public, the greater good of the public. But then in Smith, it's more like every person's fortune is for the better of, like, the general public, because everyone and everyone advancing and improving their own condition, like society moves forward. Kind of, it's like that's like difference, I think.
Well, I think it was a point that was not lost on people, that this is pretty self-oriented, self-interest. It's a big deal here, and this is kind of throwing out human ethical behavior, or turning it on its head. Because ethical behavior, what is? I mean, we're supposed to treat our fellow person as we want him or her to treat us. So this ethical behavior that motivates, or we think motivates, important things in society, it's not the main focus of Smith by any means. Yeah.
In the last part that we read, book 3, he does warn against it. I have a quote. It says, "All for ourselves and nothing for other people seems in every age of the world to have the vile maxim of the masters of mankind." And I kind of just thought that was a really important idea. Even though he says this system is pretty much perfect and everything should work out, there are going to be faults regardless because people aren't perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, he is aware of these other sides to things. And, you know, deep in the book there are all kinds of observations that he makes on people suffering through labor cycles where, you know, they can't find work, and, you know, there is suffering in the system. People in the highlands, women in the highlands with large families of which only a few children survive. You know, there definitely are costs. But when you stand back and you look, the economy itself has done more good than evil as a whole, because it has provided a growth. And there is this notion, we mentioned this notion of progress, theory of progress. He says it is a great multiplication of the productions of all the different arts in consequence of the division of labor which occasions in a well-governed society that universal opulence which extends itself to the lowest ranks of the people. The word progress occurs over 100 times in this book. So that kind of puts a different light on it, doesn't it? I mean, yeah, at some level it seems cynical, but it's not the kind of cynicism we found in Voltaire, where, you know, in the end you're just stuck in your garden and, you know, grubbing for tubers or whatever and trying to make a living, and, you know, with everybody old and creepy and, you know, falling apart. You know, here, it's not that kind of cynicism. In fact, the larger idea here is collectively, you know, we produce something more for everybody. You can argue about whether this actually works or not, but certainly at the core of this idea is the notion that humans are, you know, enjoying the benefits of progress. Do you think this is a fiction, or how do you feel about that?
I mean, I think it kind of goes back to the same thing with, like, back in the pin factory when all the people are there, they're, like, improving themselves, but they're also talking amongst themselves, and that talking creates new ideas about, oh, maybe we can, like, make this new thing or this new thing. So I think by the division of labor, it does kind of give rise to progress, because people are always thinking, bouncing ideas off each other, and therefore new things.
Yeah, so the notion of progress
is, you know, it's an abstract idea, but we certainly feel it, don't we? I mean, we don't live in the same circumstances now. Well, we have to be careful here, because obviously there are many people in the world for whom progress has not been, you know, a big factor. I mean, there's still lots and lots of hunger. You know, so progress itself is not, as far as we can tell, and we know this for sure, evenly distributed through the world. However, the concept of progress in any given society, if you look at or any given, we can talk about a country or a society or large state unit of some sort. If you look at the way things were 200 years ago and today, you know, there are evidences of something. I mean, we can argue about what progress consists of. Does it consist of more cars? What is progress? What do you think Smith's concept of progress is? Yeah,
I'm not quite sure if this answers your question, but progress is kind of a dirty word. One of the problems with it seems to be is that progress implies some kind of direction, goal, or you know, endpoint. And when we look at say the animal world, you don't see any kind of direction from descendants, you know, from Brian. And the same thing too. It seems hard to argue, or at least you get really if you if you adhere to this notion that of progress in mankind, it gets really hard to argue exactly what you mean by that. Because if you look at, for example, the Aztecs, yes, they may have been, sinister and barbaric, but at the same time, they had a much healthier relationship with the planet than we do. So, if you're not only trying to move towards some kind of artificial target, but the target is moving as you adapt the environment, it becomes almost meaningless to talk about what direction you're going in. So.
Yeah, it certainly is a much more complicated concept than we like to think when we just toss the word out and say, "Oh yeah, we're devoted to progress." But even in those, if you think of the Mayan civilizations, which flourished in Central America, one of the great locations, Tikal, collapsed. Nobody quite knows why this vast array of people specialized who built these incredible buildings and canals and all sorts of irrigation system and everything, and it collapsed long before the Europeans went to Central America. And one theory is that they just exhausted the surrounding areas. So it's probably true that humans have been doing this sort of thing for many, many years. They build up to a certain point, so there's a kind of a localized historical period of progress where, everything gets better and better, and then collapse, boom. And then, the civilization is, maybe that happened, and that has probably happened. Do you have another?
Oh, what you were just saying kind of made me think about maybe there's like some sort of conservation of progress. So maybe over a long period of time, humans have progressed, but that's also at the cost more possibilities for every individual now compared to back when the kings of an older age. All these possibilities, this increase in possibilities for us to do different things also is an increase in possibility for us to damage things, and so.
Okay.
Right. Maybe one.
All true.
Yeah.
We have powers now that very few people had before, and how do we use them? We conduct wars and we blow each other up and we do all kinds of weird things. So these greater capacities of the modern world have not necessarily delivered a unalloyed progress. There are people who would argue, with some reason, that Wordsworth's ability to sit on the hillside and contemplate this ruined abbey and the little puffs of smoke coming from the cottages down below was a richer form of life and existence than somebody sitting in a basement playing, World of Warcraft or something. I mean, we do different sorts of things with our progress, and not all of them necessarily deliver a state of enriched being. And it could be argued that major industrial countries haven't achieved the kind of mental satisfaction, emotional satisfaction that one would have thought they should have, with having so many of their material wants satisfied. So progress is a very elusive concept. But for Smith, we're back here in the 1700s. And as he looks across and as he looks at the potential of this growth and economical development, he rightly sees, incredible promise. And part of it is not just in things that people can buy and the baubles that they can own, but he also traces to this whole development the rise of towns and all these other things. What are some of the things that he suggests these economies deliver to their respective countries? What are some of the benefits? What are some of the political benefits? Nothing political? I mean, this was a major part of his last section of the book here. This whole notion that as economies develop, more people have more resources. And what happens when more people have more resources?
More specialization.
Well, the specialization delivers it, so forth. But, you know, what do they do with those resources? And how does this change their societies?
Well, they become dependent on those resources.
They definitely become, you know, they become part of their level of expectations. What kinds of expectations do people with more resources develop?
When you have that many resources and that many people, there's more of a need to be collective. So you see the development of markets, which are really, towns are not really just places to live, but places to conduct commerce. Like, you know, if you look at a lot of even like medieval towns, you know, like in Florence or Italy or wherever, the town is always centered around the piazza or the town square where all of the transactions took place.
Absolutely true. And these towns developed cadres of people who were wealthier than when they were dependent serfs on the laird's land. They develop independence. Townspeople are, you know, this is not only the place where, I mean, it's not always orderly, but the notion Smith has is as these markets developed and these towns developed around them, they developed a need for order and some level of organization. And through that organization, a sharing of power may be too grand a word, but a sharing of the say of how things should be conducted. So these towns began to offer an alternative to, you know, being stuck on the land someplace and working for the Lord. And they became centers of political growth, if you will. And when I say growth, I mean development. So he says there are three great improvements. One is that these towns stimulated production. So in these towns, as people collected together, there were more opportunities and more people got involved with, you know, producing. So towns were a direct stimulation of production itself. A second factor he mentions is the development of wealth and the use of that wealth by entrepreneurs to put land to new uses, to develop new manufactures, to utilize land that was not being used in the old system because it was just part of, you know, a vast system that was owned by somebody who really didn't think about what to do with it. So a redistribution of land, if you will, and a reutilization of land, a greater, more efficient utilization of land to produce, again, more products, more wealth. And then finally, the third is under this expansion, the third improvement is to improve order and good government. This may be, and the liberty and security of individuals. So in these towns, another level of security, another level of sort of liberty, the ability to do things on your own. So again, you know, this kind of, you don't think of medieval towns as being particularly, you know, liberal places where you could do whatever you wanted. On the other hand, the comparison out in the countryside, it was pretty much every person, you know, was pretty wild out in the countryside. Countrysides were not well. So, these commercial centers did develop more government, more distribution of liberty, and greater sources of wealth. So there was a natural progression for these places to grow. Okay, so he says here, a revolution of the greatest importance to the public happiness was in this manner brought about by two different orders of people who had not the least intention to serve the public. To gratify the most childish vanity was the sole motive of the great proprietors. So these people who made out as, wealth was produced and they sold land and all this. The merchants and the artificers, much less ridiculous, acted merely from a view to their own interests and in pursuit of their own peddler principle of turning a penny whenever a penny was to be got. Neither of them had either knowledge or foresight of the great revolution which the folly of the one and the industry of the other was gradually bringing about. So this shift in the social order from a kind of a feudal order of landholders and people living on them to a new town-centered, market-centered order in which there was wealth being produced and so forth. In Smith's view, this was a great political boon to the people who lived in these towns. And so, the economy actually didn't just make individuals and merchants especially wealthier, but it redistributed liberty. It extended liberty in new ways to people who had never had it before. And the natural growth of that process was a kind of a political progress. Now, we can debate whether that was really what was happening, but that's pretty much Adam Smith's view of what the importance of these economies were. So he says it is thus that through the greater part of Europe, the commerce and manufactures of cities, instead of being the effect, have been the cause and occasion of the improvement and cultivation of the country. A very important point. It's that process that improved the country. It's not that the country improved and then it could do more manufacture and more. So he sees it as a causal agent in the growth of human liberty and new levels of freedom and capacity that people never had before. This can be overdone. We know that the 18th century cities, and as well as the 19th century cities, London was, pretty much it was a place of great, masses of people. And it is true, there were lots and lots of people who were, whose lives were incredibly better than they had been a century before. But we only have to read someone like Charles Dickens to know that, it was pretty grim for a lot of poor people in the laboring classes themselves. Although there was a level of wealth that made it possible for them to live, did not necessarily live very well. And many of them were stuck in these manufacturing towns. So the manufacturing towns themselves, this is a painting here by J.M.W. Turner, a 19th century artist, very fine artist actually, of a place called Dudley. But it's kind of got a nice ethereal feeling to it. But underneath, well, some of this was probably smoke and grime, and the streets of many of these towns were not very, very attractive. But it's all relative, and compared to living, as a indentured servant, or living, or starving in the countryside when things weren't going well, many of these towns offered a whole new level of security. Why do people go to cities? Why do people go to towns? Why do people leave the land and go? Wordsworth would say, "You idiots, come back. But they go because life is better. There's an improvement in life. Why are the people in China moving into the big into the cities? It's, why have people from America moved into the great cities? Why are they still doing this? Because there are more resources, there are more possibilities and more potential. And yes, more freedom. So, we don't need to glamorize this view too much because, it was pretty grimy. But the fundamental concept here of these economies generating wealth and extending that wealth to wider and wider circles of people is a very powerful principle that Adam Smith captured.